You know what? All right, welcome everybody. We got a special guest here, Meredith. Thanks for coming. So we just a little background. So the Trails Committee meets monthly and second Thursday of the month, and so we and those who are on the Trails Committee are just myself, Rudy, Sue, and Betsy. We have a couple others as well. And we started out, trails have been a pretty constant theme over the past few years. We started out focused on legal trails, and it was, pretty clear there's a lot more conversations about, broader trails in Tunbridge. And so we've had a lot of conversations, a lot of things to plan, to work out, to think through and talk through. We've had other guests come. Mike Hebb, who's in charge of the Stratford network of trails, and really talking about how he's approached it. It's pretty successful over there, from what I can tell. Then we had Dave Paganelli as a speaker. Yeah. He's what is he?
County forester.
Yeah, because
he runs our forest.
Yeah,
so or he coordinates with us.
So we have two town forest spots. I sent you a link to those, and we have access, and it's great conversations with the forest committee, and it feels like a great starting point. But there's definitely a broader interest in some connecting trails, and so wanted to have you come in and kind of advise us and give us some input on we're starting here and would love to have some of your knowledge. So I'll let you kick it off, and then it's a smaller, manageable group. So I have a few questions, then I'll open it up to the room. So all right.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Meredith Naughton, and I just moved to Orange County, and I haven't spent a ton of time in Tunbridge actually, but I like it here a lot. I like riding my bike, and I like some bike loops that come through here. So I'm excited to actually spend a little more time here now. But I am a wildlife biologist with the Green Mountain Forest Service. And prior to that, I did some consulting work with some towns, some nonprofits, with the state a little bit. I've been in Vermont for 11 years. I've worked at several nonprofits. I've also worked with the state, and have focused kind of across the board on conservation and recreation. I worked at the Green Mountain Club for a little while, policy as well, and then eventually decided to go back to grad school at UVM because I wanted more of a kind of field ecology focus. And there, I fortunately had the chance to work on this really exciting project that brings me in front of you all now, where I got to wrestle with that question of what is the interaction between recreation trails and wildlife, for a few years, supported by the state, by Fish and Wildlife and Forest Parks and Rec, who wanted some answers to that question as well. Because they, like you, like many other towns, are kind of dealing with that. Like, what do we know and we don't know? What kind of science do we want? Or what is the science that we can use to make more informed decisions, basically, about where we're putting our trails and how we're managing them. So that was a long and involved and confusing, but really rewarding, awesome process. And it's left me with some information, a good handle on kind of what we as a scientific community know about the interaction, and also what we don't know, which is a lot. And I think I'm really glad that you would like to have me here to talk. And there's a whole world of, where this information fits when you're working with town forests or other public lands. It's one piece, an important piece, I think, of public land is conservation and wildlife protection. But of course, recreation is also a really important piece. Conservation wouldn't really exist without recreation. This sort of came up together in this country in a way that's allowed for land protection and plants and wildlife protection. So many of you know and understand that. I just like to give that framework that I'll answer to the best of my ability, and I most specifically have information on the interaction of wildlife and land-based kind of built recreation trails, more so than like backcountry glades or consumptive rec like fishing and hunting and trapping. All valid, great forms of recreation, but kind of the reference point I'm coming from is that wildlife and trails with some information. I also understand some attractions about the soils and the plants and things like that too. But yeah, thanks for having me here. Happy to take questions from you or from anyone else.
I'll kick it off. Not that my questions are the most important, but just get it going here. So at some point you want a picture, right? So I might at some point stand up and take a picture.
Yeah, I have to get a picture for work.
Okay.
from wherever, over there.
All right.
Captures the scene.
Great. All right, so I guess, I mean, you get a view we get a small snapshot of the state, right, and some of the themes, but you may get a broader view of the themes and some of the challenges. I wonder if you could start there. And you touched on a little bit, start there. And where is Vermont today, and some of the themes and challenges that you're seeing and hearing out there?
Oh, what a good question.
And I'll give it from a couple perspectives. Like, we live here, we recreate, it's a lifestyle, but there's also tourism, right? Deer and trails, right, is a big draw to Vermont. So
yeah, exactly. So I think there's a couple of different places to come from. One is kind of the top down, what we're hearing from the government is from the state. There's a lot of energy around recreation trails right now. And there have been some towns that have had a lot of financial growth because of their recreation trail networks. And like Jonathan said, tourism is a big part of our economy. Ski areas are a part of that, but it's kind of dispersing a little bit into lots of different types of recreation, backcountry skiing, mountain biking, hiking, like all of those are an important part of that system. And so there's a lot of money and enthusiasm going into recreation infrastructure, it seems like, and supporting towns. VOREC, you may have heard of the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative or something like that, brings together, outdoor industry folks and land managers and recreation managers all together to kind of think about this. And so there's a lot of energy because Vermont is a great place to recreate. I think from the land manager side of things, I have heard from people in all sectors, public, private, nonprofit, some trepidation a little bit, certainly some excitement as well. People love to invite folks onto their land, and a lot of folks want to take advantage of this and bring more trails to their town or to their nonprofit lands, but also a little bit of trepidation because recreation, I think, is a little bit in the Wild West right now of land management, where you might say forestry was like 60 years ago, where we had a lot of forestry practices that were great for certain outcomes, and they hadn't been, we hadn't looked at them of like, we didn't have best management practices yet, and we hadn't looked at ecological forestry and the different way that it interacts with wildlife and woods, and thought about it as on a systematic level. And now the field of forestry is so different from what it was decades ago, and there's a lot of thought and a regulation that goes into it to make forestry like a vital, important piece of the landscape, while not damaging other vital, important pieces. So recreation doesn't quite have that framework in the same way, the best management practices from an ecological standpoint, regulation, things like that. So I think one thing I'm hearing from land managers is like, okay, yes, trails, but like, how do we know what's going on? Where do we put them? Is there a point when there's too many? You know, and along with trails and people in the woods is also, you know, overuse of the woods sometimes and infractions of what you intend your trails to be, like people creating a lot of social trails that braid into the woods and create a larger impact, or camping or fires where you may not want them. So that kind of cascades a little bit as you invite more and more people to your land. So I think the outdoor industry has a lot of energy and excitement. Trail builders and recreators have a lot of energy and excitement. And I think that land managers in general want to support that while being really thoughtful. And the exact framework of how to do that doesn't exist, because every time you take this on, it has to be very site specific. You have to think about what the community wants, what the land looks like, where the other trails are in the area, like it's all of those things. So yeah, it's a work in progress. You guys are in the middle of it, kind of doing the hard work of figuring out how to handle it.
Great, so two more questions. So we as a town forest, it's kind of our forest, right? And which is gonna, you know, we're gonna create a loop where folks can see the forest, but what the number one thing I hear is people want connectors. So I wonder if you could give us advice on that. It could be connectors within the forest, could be connectors across private landowner properties.
So just so I understand, there's a loop trail that is agreed upon, more or less.
Yes.
And then connectors may be outside of that, or possibly like within that.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, so I think there's a few things to consider when you're thinking about building any trails. A loop trail is a great way to get people in the woods. The number one takeaway thing that I would say is that trail-free areas are really important for wildlife. And when I say wildlife, I mean like the full spectrum of, you know, moose, birds, fish, invertebrates. Like it, you know, wildlife is so many things. So I'm talking about that full spectrum of different types of wildlife when I say wildlife. Trail-free areas where we are not inviting folks into the woods, kind of, you know, obviously has been shown over and over again to support all wildlife much more effectively than areas with trails. So if you're thinking about your forest with this loop, that's great. The like impact or effect of a trail interacting with wildlife happens kind of immediately. So there's, if you think about a diagram where the increase of trails or trail use is down here, and the impact is up here. It's kind of like right away and then it plateaus. The difference from no trail to trail is kind of where that big change happens. And then once you have people, even if it's just one person a day, walking on a repetitive linear path in the woods, that can change invertebrate communities on the ground and separate them from one another. It can, it's repetitive enough that wildlife may change their home range, or like also learn to come to that trail. You know, squirrels, raccoons, things that are drawn by people. Which when we do anything to change the way wildlife is in the world, we don't totally know what those effects are. Okay, we've got more raccoons here, but is there a wetland where they might be eating the turtle eggs or whatever? So you've got your trail like this. You have folks walking on it. Trail-free areas can coexist with trail networks really well, with consolidated trails instead of dispersed trails. So if you have 5 miles of trails, you know, they can be within here, or they can be within like here, you know, and it can be thought of similarly as fragmentation when you make a bunch of little blocks. They're not as ecologically functional. But if you consolidate that down to a smaller area, you have reserved all of this area without trails as more ecologically functional. This gets to connectors because certainly like connectors are great because then you can, as a mountain biker, as a trail runner, I love being able to run like from town to town, or like being, it's a great aspect of trail recreations, be able to keep going. So if you're going to do a connector trail, you will want to do it in like the least impactful way, not right through like the middle of a forest block. If we think about a block of forest as, there's the interior and the edges, putting a connector trail, if possible, along the edge of a forest. So you're not disrupting the middle of a meadow, where you may have birds nesting or butterflies, and not through the middle of the forest where you may have more wildlife that need undisrupted larger home ranges, but on the edge. And I think if you have connectors that you want in the middle of your loop trail, that comes down to kind of like site specific, and that gets into the nitty-gritty weeds, which I'd be happy to advise on. But looking at what's where in the woods, how big is it also, are we talking really big and you'd want to like have your connectors just in one small area, or does it make sense that this loop trail, what's inside of it, could have several back and forth trails? And this is the recreation portion of your forest, and kind of like the ecological protection portion of your forest is elsewhere. So that's a broad answer, but those are a couple of the ways that I would think about it.
Great. So, all right, a little bit of shifting gears, but I sent you that ad that was in the paper. I don't know, it was about, no trails, don't fragment forest. We don't know who's behind that, right? It's worth a conversation. So if you look at the makeup of Tunbridge, or what's the word, agrarian society, right? And there's roads and trails and things that have been here for a long time. The town plan mentions some forests like Curtis Hill and Brocklebank. They're called, there's a term for it in the town plan.
Corridor.
I guess my question is, you mentioned trail-free zones. What about protected forests, and how do we talk about that early? Even at this stage, right? But given the makeup of Tunbridge, there's roads and trails everywhere, right? Already. So
We have some state established wildlife corridors that nick our town, and I know they're re-looking at places near us because they've contacted on this town forest, so we're coming through a lot.
Yeah.
Starting to realize that for deer in particular, that they're yarding up there,
Right.
which I know.
Yeah. Yep. The state they have kind of a full state assessment of interior forest blocks and really important connectivity corridors and wildlife crossings and things like that. And they have new data, or just more up. They did that, a decade and a half ago, and so they have some new data. They're updating that, so that's why they might be reaching out for, hey, we have more information. It looks like this could be an area where that's true. So I think all right, so thinking about protected areas, and I think I understand the question to be like where to prioritize them.
well, you mentioned trail-free zones, but is there a protected forest beyond that, right? A block of forest that we need to consider,
Yeah.
right, in general.
Right.
Which
Yeah.
can be challenging given
Given
how it's already
right.
the town is, right?
Yeah, and some of you are probably familiar with Vermont conservation design and mapping Vermont's natural history. I think is a landowner guide, and so I would start there, and look at Tunbridge. Most of Vermont is, a patchwork of varied uses, throughout. You don't have like huge blocks of wilderness, really. And so I would look to Vermont conservation design from Fish and Wildlife, and look at where those kind of high priority ecological features are, such as interior forest blocks, wildlife corridors, or road crossings. If you have a high importance wildlife road crossing, maybe keeping forest on each side of that trail free can be important. Maintain its high value. Or high diversity. There are other categories, high physical diversity, just things like gorges and cliffs and stuff like that are unique. So not sure if that exactly answers your question, but I bring that up because it's a starting place for if you wanted to have protected areas. If you look at that map and you see if there are places in Tunbridge that would be applicable for that type of protection, then that's where I would start. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would vernal pools be a concern and want to stay a distance away from a vernal pool?
Yeah. Okay, so good question. I like to think about this in stages. I think it's important to think about in stages, landscape scale and then site specific scale, and both are really important to consider. So landscape scale is kind of like what I just talked about. It's those like big connected forest blocks. It's wildlife corridors. It's like where is Tunbridge, or these parcels in Tunbridge, where are they sitting relative to other really important things? It might be an amazing forest, but it's like just surrounded by development, and it isn't necessarily functional as an important corridor or interior forest. So first looking at that and deciding, are there places closer to development? Are there places that aren't rated as this like high priority forest functionally for the state, that might be good candidates for inviting more access, for having trails? Not that it's not important or unique forest, but just that it could be an area where it is less prioritized for that protection. So that's first. And then site specific is also important. Once you say like, okay, we got this parcel, this seems like it could be a good candidate because it's like kind of on the edge near some development, and it's not necessarily mapped as this like high priority forest. Then you'd look for features that are either really sensitive, like wetlands and vernal pools are really sensitive soils. They're mucky and like will erode quickly, or high wildlife habitat value. And that could be some of those physical features like exposed bedrock or caves or cliffs, vernal pools, seeps in the woods, or things like bear-scarred beech trees and mast stands that are heavily used. So that's when you look at what you have on a site-specific scale and kind of say like, all right, we want some trails here, but you would want to buffer something like a vernal pool and not have a trail go right by it, both for that function of sensitive soils, but also because important and sensitive amphibians are using that area, and they can travel out a ways into the woods, and we would want to avoid running over them with our bikes. And that I suggest that, and I would suggest all of this. It's unfortunately none of it's cut and dry. I would say like my blanket, I would be like 300 feet from a vernal pool. But you also have to look at your landscape. If you've got your vernal pool right here, and then there's like kind of a big like cliff or ledge right here, put your trail on top of that if you want, because the amphibians are not coming down off of the cliff, so if there are kind of like bumpers or borders that you can look at the way it might be, think like a frog or think like a salamander, and you're like, well, I'm not coming down off of that. So I think I would say be flexible in those types of things, but look for important features and try and stay a distance away from them.
Questions?
Well, I have another one. Have you studied or do you have an opinion on hunting and whether hunting grounds should be separated from trails, or impact of hunting on?
I've
a lot of
heard
it?
some towns talk about this, and I've read a little bit of kind of like social science study about it. And it seems like it depends on the town. And it just kind of depends on your community. And I've seen those two things coexist really well together. And the two groups kind of mutually respect each other. And we know like, hey, this is deer season or turkey season, and we're going to stay out of here right now. And the town kind of agrees upon that. And during another, section of time, maybe kind of like through midsummer, it's not open for hunting. I believe Huntington Town Forest, Huntington or Heinsberg, I always forget, one of the H towns in Chittenden County, has a really well-developed mutual respect system between trail recreators and hunters, and it works beautifully, it seems. And they kind of developed that together. I think other towns have found that it doesn't work as well for them. So they section those places off. But I think whatever you decide just has to be really clear, and you have to have buy-in from the groups that are going to use it.
Meredith, what's usually your recommendation about if tourists did come, we created some trails? Say we even had them along the river where they were real attractive, about dogs. How do we manage that? I've been around the East Coast where some will say on a leash always, others will say if your dog has good callback,
Yeah.
you can control the dog. What do you
So,
recommend? Because I know they can be quite disruptive to wildlife.
yeah. Okay, I have two things there. The first is not a question you asked, but I do feel obliged to say is that a trail along a river corridor is actually kind of a hard place to have a trail. It's also where I want a trail because I like to walk along the river, but
Not close to the bank.
yeah, okay, yeah. Well, I guess, and it depends, what that looks like, but if there's a riparian buffer along the corridor, putting a trail right through it is kind of, that's like a really high valuable wildlife travel corridor. And it may still make sense for you guys to put that there, but I would consider, are you putting it through the entire corridor, and where's it going? I would look at the setting of that and just know that those along the riversides are actually like really unique, kind of valuable zones where I would thoughtfully put the trail if that's where you decided to do it. And to talk about dogs, yeah, so there's I've gotten a lot of questions before of like, are hikers more impactful than mountain bikers? Are they more impactful than like snowmobilers? And people want to know what the highest impact to wildlife type of recreation is, and it's all kind of a wash. It's pretty similar in the data, except for dogs. Except when you're recreating with dogs. I say this as someone who runs on trails with dogs with my dog every day. But it just like skyrockets the effect to wildlife because they're more erratic, they're more interpreted as a predator. They go sniff out all the things and they really mess stuff up as dogs do. But if you're going to allow dogs in an area, which it's hard to have a town forest and say no dogs, leash laws are seen to be like pretty effective at actually having people keep their dog on leash. And having a dog on leash is much less impactful than having a dog off leash. I would suggest a leash regulation, if kind of like wildlife protection is one of the values you want to bring to your trail area. I think it's a good idea.
It's a hard one, because I bring my dog out and I notice the deer will not even get up out of their beds. They're very used to my ATV, believe it or not.
Oh, I do believe
And
it.
they'll stay right there in their beds and their eyes are always on my dog, who's
Mhm.
well trained.
Yep,
And she's told to leave it, but they're watching her, not me.
yep, yep.
That brings up ATV. And do you have an opinion about ATV at trails or use?
In general, I think, yeah, so there's a data point that is out there in the world of like recreation ecology that is true, is in studies, ATVs and snowmobiles have seemed to have less effect than other types of recreation on wildlife, primarily because
I can hear it.
they're quick moving, they're like stable, they're not like slow and erratic like we are when we walk. We kind of like stop or keep going or go off trail or, but they're like very predictable. If you are in a car on the highway and you see a moose right there, usually it just like stops and then you go by. Longer exposure time to wildlife when you're walking or something. But my caveat with that is, in all of those studies, distance covered wasn't considered. So like a walker won't necessarily go as far as an ATVer. And they were all studying mammals. So primarily deer, but also deer and moose. So what's happening to the birds, amphibians, reptiles, and invertebrates, like we don't know. So there's not much information out there about saying that one type of recreation has more of an effect than another. Ski, walk, bike, essentially all the same. Obviously motorized rec has a different sound, it covers more ground. But I think there's not enough scientific information right now for me to suggest changing your trail management based on scientific impact to wildlife. It feels like the main thing with that is how do you want your trails to be used? Like, do you want them to be motorized rec and non-motorized recreation? And that's more of a social decision that you all will have to make.
But the impact of anything with wheels, tires I would think everybody seems to want to gyrate in mud when they have tires. They like it, whether it's ATVs or bikes. How does that affect the amphibians?
Yeah,
Because I think we're a little bit oblivious
well,
to
there's
what we're doing to the mud.
right. Well, there's the soil for one thing, and definitely wheeled, tired recreation does promote more erosion than just hiking. But yeah, there's nothing to suggest that bikes or ATVs have more effect to amphibians or other like ground dwelling critters than like skiing or walking, despite having tires.
How about horses?
That's a really good question, and there is not a ton of literature about horses. I don't have much that I can say about like equestrian recreation activities and their difference.
Well, when riding, when we're riding, we're able to come up pretty close to wildlife, and they don't, deer, sometimes bear. It's, I mean, if you were gonna hunt, you could get pretty close on a horse.
Oh.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, they certainly have been around for a couple of years.
Yeah, I would love to just use this as a time to mention, like, I think we all have a lot of experiences in the woods and like viewing wildlife. Obviously, we're a person into the woods and seeing a thing that might not be moving. that said, we don't know, like those observations that we have aren't necessarily characteristic of everything that's going on, you know? I think that it's totally, we see deer all the time. I see bear in the woods too. And the way that they may be changing their daily patterns to avoid trails can happen, or shift their home range or that sort of thing. So it's definitely true that once there's a trail, all wildlife doesn't avoid it, you know, we still interact. But there is change there. There's stress associated, heart rate increases in mammals like that, and there's higher stress levels in their poop that they find. So we know that it like is having an effect on them. And you know, the conservation concerns associated with those physiological responses are things like, you know, higher stress, maybe more susceptible to disease, shorter lifespan, things like that.
Now, is there any difference between or effects in the data if you have groups going on trails, or a single person and then maybe an hour or two later another person, or is there any data there?
Yeah, a little bit. Loud noise and big groups can have more of a like behavioral effect on usually mammals and birds that are around. But it's not that much different from like the daily just presence of people, but there is an increased presence with like groups and talking and things like that. And so I always suggest, if you do have gathering points like benches or overlooks or something like that, being really thoughtful about where you put those. And we always want them to be somewhere pretty, but somewhere pretty might be also like right by that wetland where there's like a rare bird and a rare butterfly or something like that. So thinking about that when you place your bench, having it at a really nice point in the middle of the woods, instead of somewhere incredibly sensitive or away from a vernal pool, because we know that when there's a gathering point, people kind of go out from it. You go to the bathroom, you sit over there for your lunch, that kind of thing.
Do you had a question?
Yeah, don't give me a look, Jonathan, about moving the pavilion.
Well, so we have established legal trails that the town has a right of way on, and a lot of it's been in the paper. But so when there's an established trail, and thinking about wildlife and also about preservation of the condition of the trail that the public has used for a long time, and policy here for several decades has been non-motorized use, not encouraging ATVs or Jeeps to go on the legal trails. Have you come across examples in other towns where an alternative trail is replacing, and what happens with wildlife if I don't know how they get used to, like, wow, for years, people have used this legal trail. And now there's kind of a workaround that goes maybe, you know, a big semicircle and comes back around. And then I might have a follow-up.
Sure. Let me think about that for just a second. Thinking about basically like decommissioning a trail and creating a new one.
Right.
Yeah, I would wonder what the setting is. I feel like a lot of those legal trails are around residential or semi-residential areas too. So there might, if we think about types of development with a little bit of a like glow around them that would affect wildlife, that legal trail might be a little consumed by that glow or that buffer, because it's where there are already houses or driveways or farm fields or something. And though there will be wildlife in that glow, they'll likely stick to the area without it. So replacing that legal trail with a different trail is totally fair game. And I would just suggest trying to keep it kind of within the same
Flow.
exactly. Yeah. which I know is a really vague way to talk about it, but,
That makes sense.
okay. Yeah, does that help answer your
A
question?
little bit, one thing that could happen, and it's been proposed, is that a legal trail could continue to be used for a certain type of use, and then an additional trail that circled around would be used for
Mhm.
other uses, and they would still be kind of between two property owners.
Mhm.
So it does definitely expands the area that could be impacted.
Yeah, yeah, that expands the area, you know, it like. If they're both the same length, for example, it will double the glow of the trail. Essentially, and a glow of a trail is narrower than a glow of like a house. But. Yeah, if it kind of goes back to that immediate effect. As soon as there is a trail is when things start changing. So it would be additional, which what is an okay acceptable level of density of trails before ecological function really drops off? I'm working on that question right now. I don't have an answer. We're working on it at the Forest Service because it comes up for us a lot too. You know, can we put more trails here? There's already trails. It's like, at what point do you want to have a sacrificial area? If you want to think about like national parks, you know, you've got the zone where everybody goes, and then you've got all this zone that nobody goes to.
A follow-on question if I can ask, so, like, we want a whole generation to connect with nature, I think it, right?
Yeah.
So it's like. That, like the town forest, we want kids groups to come in, right? Knowing that they may step on salamanders, right?
Mhm.
So it's like, how do you think through that? Like, you think it's better to be exposed. And have access because of that light bulb moment, right?
Yeah.
And then some of the negative impacts, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. And you may have a follow-up, I know.
Oh, sorry, Tom.
No, go with that.
But no, I think that's a good question. And it's kind of like, what are your goals for the area? I think a great goal is like exposure and education to the natural environment, because then you're kind of curating more people who want to talk about these things and care about it, you know? So I think it comes down to deciding what areas are for what. And it's okay to decide like this area is for us to experience the land, and we're going to put a trail that goes right up to the vernal pool because it's important for our kids to learn about salamanders and see them. I didn't see a salamander till I was an adult, and I feel like I really missed out. Especially if, you know, you balance it with the zone over here, which also has a vernal pool and maybe like a beach stand with some bear scarred beach where you don't have one. I think that a town forest is like an opportunity for so many things, and you just kind of have to decide where those things go, but not like eliminate any of them necessarily, because it's not for deep woods preservation, you know, it is for like the shared enjoyment of the town. Yeah.
Great. Do you have a follow-on?
Well, I just don't know if you, in your experience, whether you come across a town, and not every town in Vermont has legal trails. We have 4 here. One of them is kind of decided as far as how it's going to be used. Whether private trails had ended up in any other towns, sort of supplanting the legal trails in the right of way, sort of as a trade-off, if you come across that in any other town.
Like, because
Keeping in mind private property rights versus public right of way, and maybe an agreement made between the towns saying, okay, a private property owner has a real trouble with a legal trail, and maybe we could work out something else with the private trail. Is that unprecedented, or have you ever come across that in any town in Vermont? Or maybe you could research that or have someone look into it.
I
yeah,
think Woodstock has dealt with that a bit.
okay, so specifically the trade of, we're not going to use this legal trail anymore, and instead we'll use this other person's private trail who says that's okay.
Right, like
Yeah,
a long-term easement or a permanent easement. To
Yeah.
use another.
Yeah, I don't know specifically about that situation, that trade-off. I can imagine that it happens. Yeah, I can imagine that that happens, and that seems like a reasonable, that's kind of like comes back to just like an agreement, a legal agreement, and whether or not all parties are amenable to it.
Right.
In Calais, I used to live in Calais, there's legal trails and a lot of private trails used by the local public there. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of that happened, because I've heard of a couple of friends who like got chased out of a yard because they didn't want the legal trail to be used anymore, you know. So I could imagine that sort of thing happening.
Mhm.
And I don't unfortunately have formal advice on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're talking of going back to the glow,
Yes.
something to keep in mind about trails, if you're making new ones, is to try to cluster them. Would that be, in other words, try to keep a bunch of land on one side open, but that you might have a road, a trail, land for miles until you hit the next road.
Right.
Is that
Yeah.
a way to be thinking about?
Yeah, exactly. Because if you have, like, if you think at the smallest level and you have a bunch of trails, which understanding that like all of your trails on top of each other are all switched back is also not super pleasant. So there's like a happy medium there. But if you think about all your trails condensed to where the glow kind of like overlaps on all of them. Okay, but if you zoom it out just a little bit, then you just have these little like slivers between the glow, which like don't do that much necessarily. And if you zoom it out more, again, you're just kind of like creating these islands. So I think, yes, is the answer to your question. And just further illustrating, keeping them as compact as is like reasonable, to keep that big unaffected area is the best balance that I can suggest.
So I'm watching the clock. We have time for one more question. Just trying to end on time tonight. Anybody? Rudy? Want to bring us home with a good question?
I'm on the spot.
He's used to it.
So if we're gonna be doing some trails, let's say in the town forest, do you kind of take a survey as to actually what the wildlife is? And, you know, or what the habitat is and what you might encounter and before you start, you know, doing your trails?
Yeah, I would strongly suggest doing some type of inventory or survey of like an ecological inventory of the area to see kind of like what's functioning there now, how is it? So you go in informed of, and you can make those like site specific situations. Which like, you know, this is kind of my like ideal suggestion, like, yeah, get an ecological inventory, and that's reasonable for different towns in different ways. You know, some towns have contracted out ecological inventories before getting their trail developers to come in and plan where they want their trails to be. Some towns can't afford that if they can't find someone to do it within their budget. So yes, it's my suggestion 100% to know what's on the land. And I also understand that like costs money. So
Yeah.
I know you didn't want any more questions, but that brings up the Drew Forest. I found a couple of wood turtles.
really?
Yeah,
Oh,
in the wet
it's
area.
good to know. I like to keep my eyes out for wood turtles. I'm gonna write that down. Hold
Was
on.
that recent? One was 2 years ago.
Well, I think Dave Paganelli's done quite a bit of study of the town forest when he developed the forest management plan.
I'm sure he has, yeah. And he probably
Hasn't done the wildlife necessarily. but-
Yeah, I'm sure as somebody who spends a lot of time in the woods, he has an eye for it, but may not have. You can only focus on so many things when you're going in to do a survey, you know, and if he was going in to do like a timber stand assessment and was cruising for timber. He probably noticed some things, but wasn't specifically looking for that. He may be willing to do that. Yeah,
I just got another thing about the town forest and, or where we are gonna be doing trails. For wildlife, is it better to do like a natural trail and not add bridges or boardwalks or, I mean, is that kind of interrupt natural?
Or does it help because it keeps you out of the
Roots are-
wetland?
yeah, I think if you are going to go through a wet area, you need a bridge or a boardwalk. I would look to see if there's a way to do it differently, but yeah, a big bridge or a boardwalk, especially if you've got like a big seepy area or something like that. That will keep you from disrupting the soil, which can like change the hydrology, and that would, not having one would yeah, have a greater impact.
Great. All right, this is wonderful. I think you know, especially with everybody here collectively, we've heard it, you've opened our minds, and great to have the connection. And so you said you're in Orange County now?
Yeah, I just moved to Brookfield.
Yeah, so hopefully come around the area as much as you can. We
Yeah,
wanted
I'd
to,
love to.
we want to send you away with some official swag of Tunbridge. Brenda helped me gather this. I don't know if you've seen these before, but
I have, oh my God, I love
yeah,
it.
Tunbridge.
Thank you so much. This is awesome. Thank you. That's great. I love that. Yeah, thank you guys for having me. This has been a really enjoyable conversation. I wish you the best of luck. Please reach out again if you have more questions. I feel like kind of an asshole saying this, use my language, but if you haven't seen, there's a YouTube presentation online where I talk about some of the science more specifically. Watch my presentation. I feel like such a jerk saying that, but there is like, if you have more questions,
Jonathan has.
Yeah, you
it.
kind of
I
became a
have
mini
it.
celebrity with that around here.
Okay.
It's been shared.
It's been shared around.
so these folks can share it with you, but it just, I think it answers some more of the specific digging into the like this or this kind of thing. I'm also happy to just answer those questions on email if you have them, but
The YouTube video is a really nice snapshot of it. You did it quickly, an hour or so.
yeah,
But then there's the research paper that I've distributed to people. That's a lot more details if you're into that sort of thing. So
yeah,
it's like 200 something pages.
sure. Meredith Naughton. Which I can
Thank you.
write down or spell for you if you need, but
I can see if I can forward it to you also.
Okay.